Hey everybody, this is the top 10 video for chapter 6 on human research. The number 9 thing you should know about the chapter on human research is what are the relevant values at stake in human research. There are 4 values that are important in thinking through issues of human research and clinical trials. Those values are knowledge, beneficence, autonomy, and justice. We've talked a lot about beneficence and autonomy up to this point, but human research is a little bit different because we're concerned not primarily with the relationship between a physician and their patient, but with the relationship between a researcher and human research subjects. And one of the primary aims of doing medical research is to gain knowledge about medicine. Medical research is responsible for a number of important vaccines, including vaccines for polio, the measles, rubella, and more. Medical research has also provided us with treatments for things like heart disease and cancer and AIDS. It has also contributed to improved strategies in preventative medicine to prevent things like birth defects and heart disease, as well as contributing to diagnostic technologies. So this deep and strong yearning for medical knowledge, although one of the things that drives this medical research is to do good for patients, to make patients' lives better, to help cure diseases and treat diseases and illnesses, the knowledge that is gained through medical research bumps up against other values like beneficence, autonomy, and justice. And questions arise about whether or not human research subjects are being treated in clinical trials in ways that are in their best interest and in ways where their autonomy is respected. And as we'll see shortly, there are many examples from our history where issues of justice have arisen in medical research settings. Number 8. What is the historical context of human research in the United States and beyond? In the United States and the Western world more broadly, there is a history of human experimentation that has been morally problematic. Just some examples are the Nazi experiments, in which horrific terrorizing and mutilation of bodies, both citizens and prisoners, was done to obtain medical knowledge. Right here in the United States, there's a 40-year experiment by the U.S. Public Health Service of hundreds of black men from Alabama who were unjustly treated. Their condition of having syphilis was not disclosed to them. When penicillin became available as a cure for syphilis, they weren't treated, and these men died without any care or treatment for their disease while they were being studied and later used as subjects in autopsies for the goal of medical knowledge. Another example is the Willowbrook experiments, which included the use of children as experimental subjects. In this New York facility, children were infected with hepatitis so that researchers could learn more about the disease. So we obviously have a troubling history with medical research, which shows the need for policies, laws, and moral arguments to regulate the ways in which researchers treat their human subjects in clinical trials and medical experiments. Number 7, what is a clinical trial? A clinical trial is a scientific study that is designed to test the efficacy of medical interventions in human beings. So it's a study that's set up to test whether certain pharmaceutical drugs or surgical interventions are beneficial for patients. Clinical trials provide some of the most trustworthy evidence and knowledge about the effectiveness of surgical and pharmaceutical interventions. Number 6, what are the primary benefits of clinical trials? The primary benefits of using clinical trials for medical research is that clinical trials are really good at eliminating the bias of the researchers at maximizing the objectivity of the study and not letting subjective values seep in, and at avoiding error. They're just more accurate than other forms of research. I mean, we can know things by merely observing, but observation can be very biased. It can allow our subjective values to seep in, and it involves a lot of human error. Clinical trials are held up as the standard in medical research. Number 5, what methods make a clinical trial a good clinical trial? Good clinical trials use control groups to measure results. They use blinding, or even better, double blinding, and they use randomization. A control group is a group of people that does not receive the treatment or intervention that the experimental group receives. Placebo groups or active control groups are two options of how to proceed with control groups, but good clinical trials use some form of control group to compare the results in a population of people who are receiving the treatment or intervention and a similar group of people who is not receiving the proposed treatment or intervention. A placebo control group gets a placebo. They get a sugar pill or a fake treatment, so they don't know whether or not they're actually getting the treatment, and this allows for researchers to rule out the placebo effect. That is, that people think they're getting better because they're receiving treatment, and sometimes they even do in fact get better simply because they believe they're getting treatment. So using a placebo control group allows researchers to mitigate the placebo effect by comparing the placebo group to the experimental group. Now, some clinical trials don't use placebo groups. Some clinical trials use active control groups. Active control groups are different from placebo control groups because they are actually receiving some kind of treatment or intervention, but not the one that's being tested. Oftentimes, an active control group is used if there's already some useful treatment available for the specific medical issue. If there's already a pharmaceutical, but a new one is being tested, the active control group might be taking the current treatment while the experimental group takes the new treatment. Obviously, using a placebo control group allows for much more data through a better comparison, but sometimes it's morally required that we use an active control group. I mean, imagine if you agree to take part in a clinical trial and you don't know if you'll be in the control group or the experimental group, but to be in the trial, you have to agree to go off your current medication or treatment plan, and you may or may not receive a new treatment. You may merely get a placebo pill. This could be really problematic, particularly for certain kinds of diseases or illnesses. So sometimes it's better to use an active control group where people will at least get the currently available form of treatment as the control group. Double blinding is another method that is really important for good clinical trials. Double blinding is used to ensure that neither the researchers nor the research subjects know which treatment is being given. Blinding is when the research subject is not told whether they're receiving a placebo or the new treatment. But double blinding ensures that neither the physicians nor the patients know, and this helps to keep the data more objective and less biased. The physician won't treat the research subject any differently if they don't know whether they're in the control group or the experimental group. And finally, the method of randomization is key to a good clinical trial. This is the procedure for assigning subjects to control and experimental groups in order to avoid any kind of human error or bias. Rather than allow physicians to choose who goes into a control group or an experimental group, the method of randomization is used so that those decisions are made without human influence. Number 4, what are the ethical standards for clinical trials? The commonly accepted ethical standards for clinical trials include the following. First, that human research subjects have to meet voluntary informed consent. Second, that there has to be a balance of risks and benefits. We can't put patients at a high risk of things like serious harm or even death, especially if the possible benefits are small. Third, there has to be a fair selection process. Again, this is why randomization is required in good clinical trials. Fourth, there is a right to privacy that has to be respected in human research trials. And relatedly, the confidentiality of research has to be respected. And finally, clinical trials have to receive some kind of independent approval. Typically, this comes from an internal review board from some institution. Hospitals, universities, where research trials happen typically have internal review boards where the proposed trial has to go up for review and it must be approved by the board before the trial can begin. Number 3, what moral principles are relevant to issues of human research? This should be pretty obvious. We talked at the very beginning of the video of the values involved in human research, and we talked about knowledge along with beneficence and autonomy and justice. The moral principles at play in human research that bump into and sometimes conflict with that search for knowledge are autonomy, beneficence, and justice. This should be pretty straightforward. Number 2, what are some important moral questions concerning human research? There are many moral questions that come up in medical research settings. We'll touch upon a few. One question is whether or not control group subjects are being treated merely as means. That is, when we put people in clinical trials without guaranteeing that they're going to get any kind of treatment or intervention that might help them, in fact, they may be put into a control group, are we using them merely as a means to gaining knowledge? And is that morally problematic? According to Kant, this is problematic. So the question here is whether using control group subjects results in us using them merely as means, or whether we can respect their autonomy and meet our obligations of beneficence while putting human research subjects into control groups. So as I said, placebo-controlled trials offer us better data than active controlled trials, since we're comparing a group of people who is being treated with this new treatment or intervention to a group of people who's not being treated with anything at all. But we have to ask whether or not we should use placebo-controlled trials if there already is some current treatment or intervention available, because that means that we're taking away the treatment of a group of people, which is arguably almost always harmful to those people. So is this allowed, or does this break our obligation to the principle of beneficence? Well, the Declaration of Helsinki states that the use of placebos is unethical if effective treatments are available, but with the exception of very low-risk treatments. So perhaps if you're testing out, I don't know, a cream for a rash, you may be allowed to use a placebo group because the risk of harm is temporary and minimal. But generally, according to the Declaration of Helsinki, if there's a treatment available, the trial cannot use a placebo control group. They have to use an active control group. Another issue is whether physicians can morally recommend clinical trials and still meet their standard of beneficence to their patients. So this is where the patient-physician relationship sort of bumps up against the researcher-human research relationship. If a clinical trial results in half of the participants not receiving treatment or receiving less good treatment, is it morally problematic for a physician to recommend to their patient that they take part in such a trial, knowing that it's possible that their patient could be harmed, or at least not helped? This brings us to the concept of clinical equipoise, which makes a distinction based on the available knowledge about the clinical trial and the efficacy of the proposed treatment. Clinical equipoise is the position that a physician is in when they can be said to be in doubt about the efficacy of the proposed treatment. That is, if they don't know whether or not the proposed treatment is any good at all or better than current treatments, then this allows a physician to say, yes, I can recommend this clinical trial because I don't know that it's any better or worse to be in a placebo group or an active control group or an experimental group, because we're unclear about the efficacy of the treatment being tested. Another question that's interesting to think about in terms of human research subjects is whether or not payments and benefits undermine the process of informed consent in medical research. For example, in the Tuskegee experiments, these men who were not only lied to about their conditions and untreated even when treatment was available, they were given free medical exams and free meals, and they were also promised burial insurance. So this brings up the question of whether these kinds of benefits or payments or reimbursements actually undermine the informed consent. I mean, clearly there are issues with informed consent in the Tuskegee experiments separate from this question. But in other situations, is it possible that giving human research subjects some kind of payment or benefit in exchange for their participation could actually undermine informed consent? So we might go back to the requirements of informed consent and think through whether or not a human research subject could be said to have met informed consent despite the fact that they're receiving payments. Does that count as coercive? Are they actually making this decision and authorizing this decision in a voluntary way? Another moral issue in clinical trials is the exploitation of vulnerable populations. And this is where issues of informed consent become most complex. We've already talked about the Tuskegee experiment. This is a clear case of exploitation of vulnerable populations. There are many other cases. There's a history of excluding women from clinical trials, which has had adverse effects on women's health care. There are populations in geographically and economically disadvantaged parts of the world that have been treated in problematic ways in medical trials. And so we have to think about what kind of standards and policies and moral arguments we might come up with to handle these kinds of situations. The number one thing you should know about the chapter on human research is how issues in medical research on human subjects would be handled by the major moral theories. This should be old hat by now. You should be able to apply the major moral theories, Kantianism, utilitarianism, with distinctions between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism, virtue ethics, and even ethics of care to some of the situations. So go ahead and think through the three cases at the end of the chapter and see how these moral theories would generally respond to each of these situations and what relevant reasons come up in each of those arguments. And we made it. More on human research next time.